feared Viking warrior is wasting away from a mysterious illness. Every cure has failed, until a sharp-witted English captive steps into his life. But what she finds hiding in his home might change not only his fate, but hers as well. Thank you so much for watching, and for all your comments. Let me know at the end if you liked the story, and where you're watching from, and why you're following this. The cold winds of the northern fjords swept across the settlement of Bjornheim with a ferocity that seemed to mirror the tumultuous times that had befallen the once thriving Viking community. Snow covered the thatched roofs of the longhouses, and smoke rose from hearth fires, creating ghostly columns against the gray winter sky. The year was 892, and the settlement, nestled between towering cliffs and the churning sea, had seen better days. The men had returned from their latest raid on the English coast 3 weeks prior, their longships heavy with plunder and captives. Yet the mood in Bjornheim remained somber and tense. At the heart of this unease was Eiríkur Thornson, the Jarl's eldest son and the settlement's most formidable warrior. At 26 winters, Eiríkur stood taller than most men, his broad shoulders and muscular frame a testament to years of rigorous training and countless battles. His hair, the color of burnished copper, fell to his shoulders in thick waves, and his beard, meticulously braided in the traditional manner, framed a face that would have been strikingly handsome were it not for the pallor that had settled over his features. His eyes, a startling shade of blue like the summer sky over the fjords, had lost much of their former brilliance, dulled by the constant suffering that had become his unwelcome companion. Eiríkur's condition had begun subtly, almost 2 years ago, with occasional bouts of weakness and stomach pains that he dismissed as the aftermath of contaminated food or spoiled ale. But as the moons passed, the symptoms grew worse and more frequent. He would wake in the night, his body drenched in sweat despite the frigid air, his stomach churning with such violence that he could barely stand. The pain would strike without warning, doubling him over during training sessions or council meetings, forcing him to withdraw from the activities that had once defined his existence. The settlement's healers had tried everything in their considerable knowledge: bitter herbs boiled into teas, poultices applied to his abdomen, sacrifices made to the gods for his recovery. Nothing worked. If anything, Eiríkur's condition seemed to worsen with each passing season. The impact on Bjornheim had been profound. Eiríkur was not merely another warrior. He was the Jarl's chosen heir, the man who would one day lead their people. His father, Jarl Thorstein, was advancing in years, his once mighty strength beginning to wane. The settlement needed Eiríkur to be strong, to be ready to assume leadership, but instead they watched helplessly as their future leader withered before their eyes. Whispers had begun to circulate through the settlement, dark mutterings about curses and divine displeasure. Some claimed that Eiríkur had offended the gods during a raid, taking something sacred that should have been left alone. Others suggested that a rival Jarl had paid a vulva to curse him, ensuring that Bjornheim would fall into chaos when Thorstein finally passed to Valhalla. On this particular morning, Eiríkur stood at the entrance of his father's longhouse, one hand pressed against the carved wooden doorframe for support. Another wave of nausea had struck him upon waking, and though he had managed to keep down the thin gruel his mother had prepared, his body felt weak and unsteady. He knew he should rest, should return to his bed and conserve his strength, but pride and duty compelled him forward. Today, the captives from the English raid would be distributed among the settlement's families, and as the Jarl's son, his presence was expected. The great hall of the longhouse was already filled with people when Eiríkur entered, their voices creating a low rumble of conversation that echoed off the timber walls. Torches mounted in iron brackets cast flickering light across the assembled faces, illuminating the mixture of anticipation and curiosity that characterized such occasions. The captives, mostly farmers and villagers taken from a coastal settlement in Northumbria, stood in a huddled group near the central hearth, their faces bearing the resigned expressions of those who had accepted their fate. There were perhaps 20 of them in total, men who would work the fields and repair the settlement's structures, women who would weave cloth and prepare food, and a handful of children whose futures in Bjornheim remained uncertain. Eiríkur's eyes swept across the captives with little interest. He had seen countless prisoners before, had participated in dozens of raids since his 15th winter. These people were simply a resource, another form of plunder no different from the silver arm rings and weapons that had also been taken. He was about to turn his attention elsewhere when his gaze fell upon a woman standing slightly apart from the others, and something made him pause. She was young, perhaps 22 or 23 winters, with hair the color of autumn wheat that fell in a thick braid over one shoulder. Despite the dirt that smudged her face and the simple, worn condition of her dress, there was something striking about her appearance. Her features were delicate but defined, her chin held at an angle that suggested defiance rather than defeat. But it was her eyes that truly captured Eriker's attention. They were the deep green of forest moss, and they blazed with an intelligence and spirit that seemed entirely at odds with her current circumstances. While the other captives stared at the floor or gazed blankly ahead, this woman's eyes moved constantly, taking in every detail of the longhouse, studying the faces of her captors with an intensity that was almost unnerving. Jarl Thorstein rose from his high seat, a massive chair carved from oak and decorated with intricate patterns representing the settlement's history and the gods they honored. Despite his age, which Eriker estimated to be somewhere near 50 winters, Thorstein remained an imposing figure. His hair and beard had gone completely gray, but they were still thick and full, and his voice, when he spoke, carried the authority of decades of leadership. "Good people of Bjornheim," Thorstein began, his voice filling the hall and silencing the murmured conversations. "We have returned from England with wealth and workers to strengthen our settlement. Today, these captives will be assigned to households according to our needs and your service to our community." The distribution process was methodical and familiar. Thorstein called forward various families, assessing their needs and assigning captives accordingly. The strongest men went to families who worked the largest farms or who needed help with construction projects. Women skilled in specific crafts were matched with households that could benefit from their knowledge. Eriker watched the proceedings with half his attention. The other half focused on managing the discomfort that was building in his stomach once again. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, trying to find a position that might ease the cramping sensation that was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. When only a handful of captives remained, Thorstein turned his attention to his son. "Eriker," he called out, his voice carrying a note of concern that did not escape the notice of those assembled. "You have not yet claimed anyone from this group. Surely there is someone here who could be of use to you." Eriker wanted to refuse, to explain that he had no need for a thrall when he could barely manage his own daily existence, but he knew such a response would only fuel the rumors about his declining health. He forced himself to straighten, to push away from the wall he had been subtly leaning against, and stepped forward to examine the remaining captives more closely. There were 2 older men, their bodies bent from years of hard labor, a woman of middle years with a perpetually fearful expression, and the green-eyed woman who had caught his attention earlier. Up close, Eriker could see that the woman was taller than he had initially thought, her posture straight despite the obvious exhaustion that lined her features. Her hands, clasped in front of her, were not the soft hands of nobility, but showed the calluses and small scars of someone accustomed to work. When his eyes met hers, she did not look away as the others did, and he found himself studying her with growing curiosity. There was something different about this one, something that suggested she possessed knowledge or skills beyond the ordinary. "This one," Eriker said, gesturing toward the woman. His voice came out rougher than he intended, strained by the effort of maintaining his composure while pain radiated through his abdomen. "She will come to my household." A ripple of surprise moved through the assembled crowd. It was unusual for an unmarried warrior to claim a female thrall, and given Eriker's condition, many wondered what use he could possibly have for her. The woman herself showed no visible reaction to his choice, though Eriker thought he detected a slight narrowing of her eyes, as if she were reassessing him in light of this development. Thorstein nodded his approval, though his expression suggested he too was puzzled by his son's selection. "So be it. The woman is yours, Eriker. See that she is put to good use." He paused, then added in a lower voice meant only for his son's ears, "Perhaps she can help your mother with preparing your meals and tending to your needs. The gods know you require more care than you admit." Eriker bristled at the implication of weakness but held his tongue. He gestured curtly for the woman to follow him and turned toward the longhouse entrance, moving perhaps more quickly than was wise. The combination of wounded pride and physical discomfort made him want nothing more than to escape the pitying glances and whispered conversations that he knew would begin the moment he left the hall. The walk from his father's longhouse to his own dwelling was mercifully short, though the cold air bit at Eriker's face and made his already roiling stomach clench even tighter. His home was smaller than the Jarl's residence, but still substantial, a mark of his status as heir. It consisted of a main room with a central hearth, a sleeping alcove separated by a heavy curtain, and a storage area where food and supplies were kept. The walls were hung with weapons and shields from his various campaigns, and furs covered the sleeping bench, providing warmth during the brutal winter nights. The woman followed him inside, her steps silent on the packed earth floor. Eriker moved immediately to the hearth, where embers still glowed from the morning fire. He added several pieces of wood, needing both the warmth and the distraction of the task. When the flames began to catch and grow, he finally turned to face his new thrall, finding her standing near the door, her eyes once again taking in every detail of her surroundings. "What is your name?" Eriker asked, lowering himself carefully onto a bench near the fire. The warmth felt good against his skin, though he knew from experience it would do nothing to ease the pain that was steadily intensifying. The woman's gaze shifted to him, and for a moment, he thought she might refuse to answer. Then, in a voice that carried the melodic accent of the English but was steady and clear, she replied, "I am called Elthrith." "Elthrith," Eriker repeated, the unfamiliar syllables feeling strange on his tongue. "You will work in this household. You will prepare food, maintain the fire, clean, and whatever other tasks are required. In return, you will have shelter, food, and protection. Do you understand?" "I understand," Elthrith responded, her tone neutral, revealing nothing of her thoughts or feelings about this arrangement. Eriker studied her for a moment longer, trying to discern what it was about her that had compelled him to make his choice. She met his gaze without flinching, and he found himself both irritated and intrigued by her apparent fearlessness. Most thralls, especially newly captured ones, exhibited either terror or sullen resentment. This woman showed neither. A sudden, violent cramping seized Eriker's stomach, so intense that he gasped involuntarily and doubled forward, his hands clutching at his midsection. The pain radiated outward in waves, each one worse than the last, and he felt sweat break out across his forehead despite the chill that still lingered in the air. He tried to breathe through it, tried to maintain some semblance of control, but the agony was overwhelming. His vision began to blur at the edges, and a wave of nausea so powerful that he could not suppress it rose in his throat. Through the haze of pain, Eriker was dimly aware of Elthrith moving toward him, her footsteps quick and purposeful. He wanted to tell her to stay back, to maintain her distance, but he could not form the words. His body betrayed him completely as he retched, though his stomach was too empty to produce more than bile. The humiliation of displaying such weakness before a thrall, before anyone, made the physical suffering even worse. He felt hands on his shoulders, surprisingly strong and steady, guiding him to lie down on the bench. A cool cloth appeared, wiping the sweat from his face with gentle efficiency. Through his half-closed eyes, Eriker could see Elthrith's face above his, her expression no longer neutral but focused and assessing in a way that reminded him of the healers who had examined him so many times before. "How long have you suffered like this?" Elthrith asked, her voice quiet but firm, carrying an authority that seemed at odds with her position as a captive thrall. Eriker wanted to tell her it was none of her concern, wanted to order her away so he could suffer in private, but another wave of pain stole his breath and his pride along with it. 2 years, he managed to gasp out between clenched teeth. "Perhaps longer. It grows worse." Elthrith's hands moved to his abdomen, pressing gently in different areas, her touch clinical and impersonal. Eriker flinched when her fingers found a particularly tender spot just below his ribs on the right side, and he saw her eyes narrow thoughtfully. She continued her examination for another moment, then stepped back, her expression troubled. "Has anyone examined what you eat?" she asked. "The foods you consume regularly? The preparation of your meals?" The question struck Eriker as odd. "The healers have tried many remedies," he replied, his breathing beginning to steady as the worst of the pain started to recede into the dull ache that had become his constant companion. "Herbs, offerings to the gods, even rituals performed by a vulva. Nothing has helped." "That is not what I asked," Elthrith said, and there was something in her tone that made Eriker look at her more closely. "I asked about your food, what you eat each day, how it is prepared, Who prepares it? Eriker struggled to sit up, frustrated by his weakness and confused by the direction of her questions. What does food have to do with anything? I eat the same as everyone else in the settlement. Bread, porridge, meat when we have it, ale and mead. There is nothing unusual about my diet. Elthryth moved to the storage area, and Eriker heard her rummaging through the supplies kept there. When she returned, she held a small sack of grain and a jar that he recognized as containing honey. She opened the grain sack and examined its contents carefully, then did the same with the honey jar. Her frown deepened with each item she inspected. "Tell me," she said, turning back to face him, "do you eat bread every day? Porridge made from grain? Cakes sweetened with honey?" "Of course," Eriker replied, bewildered by these questions. "Such foods are the foundation of our meals. What household does not consume them regularly?" Something flickered across Elthryth's face, an expression that might have been recognition or perhaps the confirmation of a suspicion. She set down the items she had been holding and approached him again, her green eyes intense and serious. "I need to ask you something that may seem strange," she said carefully, "and I need you to answer honestly. When you consume these foods, bread and porridge and honey cakes, does your suffering grow worse in the hours that follow?" Eriker opened his mouth to dismiss the question as nonsense, but then he paused, actually considering it for the first time. He thought back over the countless episodes of pain, trying to recall what he had eaten before each one. The pattern, once he began to look for it, was undeniable. The worst attacks always seemed to come after meals, particularly after he had consumed large amounts of bread or porridge. On the rare days when he felt too ill to eat much of anything, or when he subsisted mainly on meat and vegetables, the pain was less severe. "Yes," he said slowly, the realization dawning with a mixture of hope and disbelief. "Yes, it does seem that way. But how can that be? Grain and bread are good, wholesome foods. They sustain our people. How could they cause harm?" Elthryth sat down on the bench across from him, her posture straight but her expression thoughtful. "In my homeland, in England, I have seen others who suffer as you do. Not many, but enough that I began to recognize the signs. There is something in wheat and certain other grains that some people cannot tolerate. Their bodies react to it as if it were poison, causing terrible pain and sickness. I do not fully understand why this happens, only that it does. My mother was a healer of some skill, and she taught me much about the preparation of medicines and the observation of illness. She had treated several people with similar symptoms, and she found that when they stopped eating grain-based foods, their suffering ceased." Eriker stared at Elthryth as if she had spoken in a language he could not comprehend. The idea that the very foods that formed the foundation of Viking sustenance could be causing his mysterious illness seemed absurd, almost laughable. Yet even as skepticism rose within him, he could not deny the pattern she had identified. The correlation between his consumption of bread and grain-based foods and the subsequent attacks of pain was too consistent to be mere coincidence. "You are suggesting," he said slowly, choosing his words with care, "that if I simply stop eating bread and porridge, this suffering that has plagued me for 2 years will cease? That the answer has been this simple all along, and every healer in Bjornheim has overlooked it?" Elthryth met his gaze steadily, unflinching in the face of his incredulity. "I am not suggesting anything with certainty," she replied, her voice calm and measured. "I am merely sharing what I have observed in others who displayed similar symptoms. The decision of whether to try this approach rests with you, but I will say this. What harm could come from attempting it? If I am wrong, you will have sacrificed nothing but a few days of bread consumption. If I am right, you may find relief from pain that has stolen 2 years of your life." The logic was sound, Eriker had to admit, though accepting help from a thrall, and a foreign one at that, rankled his pride. He was the Jarl's son, a warrior who had commanded men in battle and earned glory in raids across the sea. To think that his salvation might come from an English captive woman rather than the skilled healers and powerful vulvas of his own people was difficult to accept. Yet desperation had a way of eroding even the strongest pride, and Eriker had grown desperate indeed. "Very well," he said finally, the words feeling strange as they left his mouth. "I will try this. But you will prepare my meals yourself, and you will tell no one of this arrangement. If word spreads through the settlement that I am taking advice from a thrall, it will undermine what little authority I have left. Do you understand?" "I understand," Elthrith replied, and Eriker thought he detected the faintest hint of satisfaction in her expression, as if she had won some small victory. I will need to know what foods are available, what can be obtained from the surrounding area or through trade. If you cannot eat grain, your diet must be carefully planned to ensure you still receive adequate nourishment. Over the following hour, as the weak winter sun climbed higher in the gray sky outside, Elthrith conducted a thorough inventory of Eriker's food stores. She examined everything with the same focused intensity he had noticed earlier, asking questions about preparation methods, frequency of consumption, and sources of supply. Eriker watched her work with growing curiosity, noting the confidence with which she moved and spoke. This was not the behavior of a terrified captive, but rather of someone comfortable with her knowledge and secure in her abilities. "Tell me about yourself," Eriker said abruptly, interrupting her examination of a basket of dried fish. "You said your mother was a healer. What else were you in England before the raid?" Elthrith paused in her work, her hand stilling on the basket's woven rim. For a moment, Eriker thought she might refuse to answer, might retreat into the sullen silence that characterized so many thralls. But then she straightened, turning to face him fully, and he saw a flicker of something in her green eyes that might have been pain or perhaps simply the weight of memory. "My mother was known throughout our region for her healing skills," Elthrith began, her voice taking on a distant quality as she spoke of her former life. "People would travel for days to seek her help with ailments that others could not cure. She had a gift for observation, for seeing patterns in symptoms that revealed the true nature of an illness. From the time I was a small child, she taught me everything she knew: how to identify medicinal herbs, how to prepare poultices and tinctures, how to read the signs a body gives when something is wrong within it." She moved back to the bench and sat down, her posture somehow both weary and dignified. "My father was a merchant of modest success. We were not wealthy, but we lived comfortably in a village near the coast. I was to be married in the spring to the son of another merchant, a good match that would have secured my future." Her lips curved into a bitter smile. "Then your people came. My father died trying to defend our home. My mother was killed when she refused to tell your warriors where we had hidden our valuables. And I was taken, along with everyone else who survived, to be sold as a slave in a foreign land." The stark recitation of these facts, delivered without tears or theatrical emotion, somehow made them more powerful. Eriker felt an uncomfortable twinge of something that might have been guilt or perhaps empathy. He had participated in many raids, had seen countless villages burned and families torn apart. It had always been simply the way of things, the natural order of strong taking from weak. But hearing Elthrith speak of her losses in such plain terms forced him to consider, perhaps for the first time, the human cost of such actions. "I am sorry for your losses," Eriker said, the words feeling inadequate even as he spoke them. "War is hard, and raids are part of our culture, our way of life, but that does not make the pain of those affected any less real." Elthrith studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "Your apology changes nothing," she said finally. "My parents are still dead, and I am still a slave, but I appreciate the acknowledgement nonetheless. It is more than most of your people would offer." An awkward silence fell between them, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the distant sounds of the settlement going about its daily business. Eriker found himself unsure how to proceed, caught between his ingrained assumptions about the proper relationship between master and thrall, and a growing recognition that Elthrith was unlike any captive he had encountered before. "We should begin the new diet immediately," Elthrith said, breaking the silence with characteristic practicality. "The sooner we start, the sooner we will know if my theory is correct. For the midday meal, I will prepare fish and vegetables. No bread, no porridge, nothing made from grain. Can you accept such fare?" Eriker nodded, though the thought of a meal without bread felt strange and somehow incomplete. "I can accept it, but you will eat as well. I will not have my thrall collapsing from hunger because she was too focused on her work to tend to her own needs." Something shifted in Elthrith's expression, a slight softening around her eyes that suggested his consideration had surprised her. "Thank you," she said quietly. "That is kind of you." As Elthrith set about preparing the meal, Eriker retreated to his sleeping alcove, ostensibly to rest but in truth to think about the strange turn his life had taken. Just this morning, he had been resigned to another day of suffering, another round of pitying glances and whispered concerns. Now, impossibly, he found himself with a thread of hope that had not existed before. More puzzling still was the source of that hope. A woman who by all rights should hate him and his people, who had every reason to wish him continued suffering, yet who had instead offered knowledge that might save him. He dozed fitfully for a while, his sleep troubled by fragmented dreams of raids and burning villages, of green eyes that watched him with an intensity he could not interpret. When he woke, the light slanting through the smoke hole in the roof had changed angle, indicating that several hours had passed. The smell of cooking food filled the longhouse, and his stomach, for once, did not immediately rebel at the prospect of eating. Elthryth had prepared a simple but substantial meal: roasted fish seasoned with herbs, turnips and carrots cooked until tender, and a salad of winter greens that must have come from someone's carefully tended indoor garden. She had set out 2 wooden bowls and horn spoons, arranging everything with a care that spoke of her upbringing in a household where such details mattered. They ate in relative silence, Erica acutely aware of how unusual this situation was. In Viking culture, thralls typically ate separately from their masters, often subsisting on scraps and leftovers. To share a meal at the same time, at the same hearth, blurred the rigid social boundaries that governed such relationships. Yet Erica found he did not mind the arrangement. Elthryth's presence was neither obtrusive nor servile. She simply was, occupying her space with a quiet confidence that he found oddly comfortable. As he ate, Erica paid careful attention to his body's responses, half expecting the familiar cramping to begin at any moment. But the meal sat easily in his stomach, causing none of the distress that usually accompanied eating. It was too soon to draw any conclusions, he knew, but the absence of immediate pain was encouraging nonetheless. "This is good," he said, gesturing to the food with his spoon. "You have skill in the kitchen." "My mother insisted I learn all aspects of running a household," Elthryth replied. She said that healing knowledge was valuable, but a woman needed practical skills as well. "I spent as much time learning to cook and preserve food as I did studying medicinal herbs." "Your mother sounds like she was a wise woman," Erica observed. "Practical knowledge is often more valuable than people realize." They continued eating, and gradually, tentatively, a conversation began to develop between them. Erica found himself telling Elthryth about Bjornheim, about the settlement's history and the various families that comprised its population. She listened attentively, asking occasional questions that demonstrated both her intelligence and her desire to understand her new circumstances. In turn, she shared more about her life in England, painting a picture of a world that was simultaneously familiar and foreign to Erica's experience. The afternoon wore on, and Erica realized with some surprise that he felt better than he had in months. The constant gnawing discomfort that had become his baseline state had diminished to a faint echo. It might be coincidence, he told himself, or perhaps simply a good day in the unpredictable cycle of his illness, but a small, hopeful part of him wondered if Elthryth's theory might actually be correct. As evening approached, bringing with it the early darkness of winter, a knock sounded at the door. Erica called for the visitor to enter, and his younger brother Bjorn stepped inside, bringing with him a gust of cold air and the scent of snow. Bjorn was 22 winters old, nearly as tall as Erica but leaner in build, with the same copper-colored hair but worn shorter, in the style favored by younger warriors. His face bore the easy confidence of someone who had not yet experienced significant hardship or loss. "Brother," Bjorn greeted him, his eyes immediately finding Elthryth and studying her with undisguised curiosity. "I heard you claimed a thrall from the English captives. I had to come see for myself what prompted such an unusual choice, given your condition." Erica felt a flash of irritation at his brother's tactless reference to his illness, but he kept his voice neutral. "Elthryth is skilled in household management and food preparation. I thought her abilities might be useful." Bjorn's gaze lingered on Elthryth, and Erica recognized the appreciative look in his brother's eyes. Despite her captive status and worn appearance, Elthryth's beauty was evident, and Bjorn had always had an eye for attractive women. "Indeed," Bjorn said, a slight smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "Though I wonder if her skills in the kitchen were your only consideration." Before Erica could formulate a response that would not reveal his true reasons for choosing Elthryth, his brother continued, "Father wishes to see you. There is to be a council meeting tomorrow morning. Jarl Ragnvald from the Eastern Settlement has sent word that he plans to visit next month, and Father wants to discuss preparations." The mention of Jarl Ragnvald immediately drew Erica's full attention. Ragnvald was the leader of the largest and most powerful settlement in the region, and his relationship with Bjornheim had always been complicated. On the surface, the two jarls maintained cordial relations, but beneath that veneer lay a simmering rivalry and mutual suspicion. Ragnvald was known to be ambitious, always seeking to expand his influence and power. A visit from him could mean many things, none of them simple. "I will attend the meeting," Eiríkur assured his brother. "Tell father I will be there at first light." Bjorn nodded, but he made no move to leave, his attention still fixed on Ealhthryth. "What is your name, thrall?" he asked, his tone carrying the casual authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Ealhthryth," she replied, her voice level and her gaze steady as she met Bjorn's eyes. "Ealhthryth," Bjorn repeated, seeming to savor the foreign syllables. "You are fortunate my brother claimed you. He is far kinder than most masters would be." He paused, then added with a grin that did not quite reach his eyes, "Though I confess I am curious about what services you provide that might improve his health. Perhaps I should acquire an English thrall for myself." The implication in Bjorn's words was clear, and Eiríkur felt anger surge through him. "That is enough, Bjorn," he said sharply. "Ealhthryth is here to manage my household, nothing more. I would appreciate it if you would refrain from insulting her with crude suggestions." Bjorn's eyebrows rose in surprise at his brother's vehement defense of a thrall, but he held up his hands in a gesture of mock surrender. "No offense intended, brother. I was merely making conversation." He moved toward the door, then paused and looked back. "Though I must say, you seem more energetic than I have seen you in some time. Perhaps this arrangement is already proving beneficial, whatever its true nature might be." After Bjorn left, Eiríkur turned to Ealhthryth and found her watching him with an expression that might have been gratitude, or perhaps simply acknowledgement. "You did not need to defend me," she said quietly. "I am accustomed to such comments. They are part of the reality of being a thrall. That does not make them acceptable," Eiríkur replied, surprised by the strength of his own conviction. "You are under my protection now, and while you remain in my household, you will be treated with respect." The evening meal was another grain-free affair, this time featuring preserved meat from the autumn hunt, cooked greens, and root vegetables roasted in the embers of the fire. Once again, Eiríkur noted with growing excitement that his stomach remained calm, the food settling comfortably without triggering the familiar pain. It had been an entire day since he had consumed any grain-based foods, and he felt better than he had in months. The evidence was becoming harder to dismiss as mere coincidence. That night, as Eiríkur lay in his sleeping alcove and Ealhthryth settled onto a pallet near the hearth that she had prepared for herself, he found his thoughts returning again and again to the remarkable change that had occurred in just one day. If Ealhthryth was right, if the solution to his years of suffering was truly this simple, then everything would change. He could resume his training, could reclaim his position as the settlement's foremost warrior, could fulfill the destiny that his illness had seemed to steal from him. But beyond the personal implications, Eiríkur found himself thinking about the woman who had brought this knowledge to him. Ealhthryth was a mystery, a contradiction of strength and vulnerability, pride and pragmatism. She had every reason to let him suffer, to take some small revenge for the losses she had endured at Viking hands. Instead, she had offered healing, had shared knowledge that could transform his life. The question of why puzzled him, kept him awake long after the fire had burned down to glowing embers and the longhouse had fallen into the deep quiet of night. In the darkness, he heard Ealhthryth's breathing, steady and even, suggesting she had found sleep more easily than he had. Eiríkur wondered what dreams might visit her in the night, whether she dreamed of her lost home and family, or had already begun to accept her new reality in Bjornheim. He wondered, too, what the future might hold for both of them, how this unexpected connection between Viking warrior and English captive might develop in the days and weeks to come. The questions followed him into sleep, and when morning came, Eiríkur woke feeling more rested and alert than he had in 2 years. The chronic exhaustion that had become his constant companion had lifted, replaced by an energy that was almost foreign after so long without it. He rose from his bed and emerged from the alcove to find Ealhthryth already awake, tending to the fire and preparing the morning meal. "How do you feel?" she asked, looking up from her work as he approached. "Different," Eiríkur admitted, rolling his shoulders and stretching muscles that had been too weak for such movements just days before. "Better. Much better." It seems your theory may have merit. A smile crossed Elthryth's face, genuine and unreserved, and Erica was struck by how it transformed her features. I am glad, she said simply, though we must maintain the diet strictly for at least several weeks to be certain. Sometimes symptoms can return if the problematic foods are reintroduced too soon. Erica nodded his understanding, then prepared himself for the council meeting his father had called. He dressed carefully, choosing clothing that emphasized his status while being practical for the cold weather outside. As he fastened his cloak with a bronze brooch that had been a gift from his father, he caught Elthryth watching him with an expression he could not quite read. "What is it?" he asked. "Nothing," she replied, then hesitated before adding, "You carry yourself differently today, with more confidence. It suits you." The observation, delivered without flattery or ulterior motive, pleased Erica more than he cared to admit. He thanked her and left the longhouse, stepping out into a morning that seemed brighter and more full of possibility than any he had experienced in recent memory. The great hall of Jarl Thorstein's longhouse was already crowded when Erica arrived, the air thick with the smell of wood smoke, unwashed bodies, and the tension that always accompanied important gatherings. The council consisted of the settlement's most influential men, landowners, successful traders, and seasoned warriors whose opinions carried weight in matters affecting Bjornheim's future. They stood in small clusters, their voices low as they discussed the upcoming visit from Jarl Ragnvald, each man offering his own theory about what the powerful Jarl might want. Erica's entrance caused a ripple of reaction through the assembled men. Heads turned, conversations paused, and he could see the surprise registered on many faces as they took in his appearance. He stood straighter than he had in months, his shoulders back and his stride confident rather than the careful, pained shuffle they had grown accustomed to seeing. The pallor that had haunted his features had begun to fade, replaced by a healthier color that spoke of renewed vitality. "Erica!" his father called from the high seat, his voice carrying both welcome and barely concealed astonishment. "Come, join us. You look well this morning, better than I have seen you in some time." "I feel well, father," Erica replied, moving through the crowd to stand near Thorstein. "Perhaps the worst of my illness has finally passed." Murmurs of approval and relief swept through the hall. The settlement's future depended heavily on Erica's ability to lead when the time came, and his apparent recovery was news that lifted everyone's spirits. Bjorn, standing to their father's right, studied his brother with an expression that mixed genuine gladness with something that might have been confusion or perhaps suspicion. Thorstein raised his hand, calling for silence. "We have much to discuss," he began, his voice taking on the formal tone he used for council matters. "As you all know, Jarl Ragnvald has announced his intention to visit Bjornheim next month. This is both an honor and a concern. Ragnvald does not travel merely for social purposes. When he comes with purpose, and we must be prepared for whatever that purpose might be." An older warrior named Torkel, his face weathered by decades of hard living and harder battles, spoke up. "What do we know of Ragnvald's current circumstances? Has there been news from the eastern settlement that might explain this visit?" "Our traders report that Ragnvald has been consolidating power," another man answered. This was Ivar, a merchant who maintained contacts throughout the region and whose information was usually reliable. He has brought several smaller settlements under his direct control, either through marriage alliances or, in at least 2 cases, through threats of force. His ambitions are growing, and he seeks to become the dominant power in all the northern territories. The implications were clear to everyone present. Bjornheim occupied a strategic position, with access to excellent harbors and rich fishing grounds. For someone like Ragnvald, bringing Thorstein's settlement under his influence would be a significant prize. The question was how he intended to accomplish this goal. "He will likely propose some form of alliance," Thorstein said, voicing what many were already thinking. "The question is what terms he will demand and whether we can accept them while maintaining our independence." "Perhaps he seeks a marriage alliance," suggested another council member, a landowner named Ketil. "You have 2 sons, Jarl Thorstein. Ragnvald has a daughter of marriageable age, or so I have heard. Such a union could bind our settlements without requiring submission." The suggestion hung in the air, and Erica felt multiple sets of eyes turned toward him. As the elder son and heir, he would be the logical choice for such an arrangement. The thought filled him with a complex mixture of emotions. Political marriages were common among the Norse. practical arrangements that served the interests of families and settlements rather than the desires of individuals. He had always known that his eventual marriage would likely be determined by such considerations rather than personal preference. Yet now, with his health mysteriously restored through Elthryth's intervention, the prospect of being bound to a stranger for political purposes felt more constraining than it might have just days before. He pushed the thought aside, recognizing it as premature. Nothing had been proposed yet, and there was no point in worrying about hypothetical scenarios. "We will not speculate further without more information," Thorstein declared. "When Ragnvald arrives, we will hear what he has to say and then decide our course. In the meantime, we must ensure Bjornheim presents itself in the best possible light. Our stores should be checked, our defenses reviewed, and our hospitality prepared. We want Ragnvald to see a settlement that is thriving and strong, not one that could be easily dominated." The council continued for another hour, with various men offering suggestions and raising concerns. Eiríkur contributed where appropriate, noting with satisfaction that his thoughts came more clearly than they had in months, unfogged by the constant distraction of pain. When the meeting finally concluded, he was preparing to leave when his father called him back. "Walk with me, Eiríkur," Thorstein said, rising from his seat with a slight grunt that spoke of his advancing years. "I would speak with you privately." They left the longhouse together, walking along the settlement's main path as snow began to fall in lazy spirals from the gray sky. For a few minutes neither man spoke, and Eiríkur waited patiently for his father to organize his thoughts. Thorstein had never been one to rush into conversation, preferring to consider his words carefully before speaking. "Your improvement is remarkable," Thorstein finally said, his breath creating small clouds in the cold air. "Just yesterday you could barely stand through the distribution of captives. Today you look as you did before this illness took hold. What has changed?" Eiríkur had anticipated this question and had prepared his answer carefully. He could not tell his father the complete truth without revealing Elthryth's role, and he had promised to keep that information private. Yet he could not lie outright to Thorstein either. "I have made some changes to my diet," he said, choosing his words with care, eliminating certain foods that seemed to worsen my symptoms. "The improvement has been dramatic, though it is too soon to say whether it will last." Thorstein stopped walking and turned to face his son, his weathered face intent. "What foods? And why did our healers not suggest this approach?" "Grain-based foods, primarily," Eiríkur replied. "Bread, porridge, anything made from wheat or barley." As for why the healers did not suggest it, I think they were looking for complex answers to what turned out to be a simple problem. Sometimes the obvious solution is overlooked in favor of more elaborate remedies. His father studied him for a long moment, and Eiríkur had the distinct impression that Thorstein suspected there was more to the story than he was being told. But the Jarl was too wise to press when his son was clearly not ready to reveal everything. Instead, he nodded slowly and resumed walking. "If this continues," Thorstein said, "if you truly are recovering, it changes everything. You know this, yes? The settlement's future, my ability to negotiate with Ragnvald from a position of strength, all of it depends on having a healthy heir. I need to know, Eiríkur, and I need you to answer honestly. Do you believe this recovery is real and lasting, or is it merely a temporary respite?" The question carried enormous weight, and Eiríkur understood why his father needed to ask it. Political decisions made now could affect Bjornheim for generations to come. If Eiríkur's recovery proved temporary, if he relapsed into his previous state of illness, it would weaken their position considerably when dealing with someone as ambitious and calculating as Jarl Ragnvald. "I believe it is real," Eiríkur said, and he was pleased to find that he spoke with genuine conviction. "I cannot explain exactly why or how, but something fundamental has changed. For the first time in 2 years, I feel like myself again. My mind is clear, my body strong. If I maintain the dietary changes I have made, I see no reason why this should not continue." Thorstein's expression softened, and he reached out to grip his son's shoulder with a hand that still possessed considerable strength despite the Jarl's age. "Then there is hope," he said quietly. "More hope than we have had in a long time. Continue whatever regimen you have begun, Eiríkur. Do whatever is necessary to maintain your health. The future of everyone in Bjornheim may well depend on it." They spoke for a while longer about various settlement matters before Thorstein returned to his longhouse to attend to other business. Eiríkur made his way back to his own dwelling, his mind turning over the implications of the council meeting and his father's words. The pressure of expectation, which had lifted somewhat during his illness, as others had stopped counting on him, now settled back onto his shoulders with renewed weight. He found Elthryth in the longhouse, engaged in the task of mending one of his tunics that had developed a tear along the seam. She looked up as he entered, her needle pausing in its work, and Erica was struck again by how naturally she had settled into her role. Most thralls, especially newly captured ones, moved through their tasks with the mechanical efficiency of those who had resigned themselves to their fate. Elthryth worked with a different quality, as if she had chosen these tasks rather than having them imposed upon her. "The council meeting went well?" she asked, setting aside the mending and rising to prepare a drink for him. It was a small gesture, the kind of hospitality that any thrall might offer, but something in the way she did it felt less like servitude and more like simple consideration. "Well enough," Erica replied, accepting the cup of water she offered, "though it has raised questions about the future that I am not yet ready to answer." He paused, then added, "My father asked about my sudden improvement. I told him about the dietary changes, but not about your role in discovering the cause." "I hope that does not offend you." Elthryth shook her head. "I understand the need for discretion. A Jarl's son taking medical advice from an English thrall would raise eyebrows and invite unwelcome questions. Your secret is safe with me." They fell into a comfortable rhythm over the following days, and Erica found himself looking forward to returning to his longhouse each evening. Elthryth proved to be an excellent conversationalist, well-educated for a woman of her status, and possessed of opinions that she was not afraid to express. They discussed everything from cooking techniques to the differences between English and Norse culture, from shipbuilding to the healing properties of various herbs. Erica also resumed his training with renewed vigor, pushing his body through exercises and combat drills that had been impossible during his illness. His sword work, rusty from disuse, gradually returned to its former precision. His strength, depleted by months of suffering, began to rebuild. The other warriors noticed the change, and soon Erica found himself once again at the center of the settlement's martial activities, leading practice sessions and offering instruction to younger fighters. Word of his recovery spread quickly through Bjornheim, generating excitement and relief among the population. For many, Erica's illness had been a dark shadow hanging over the settlement's future. His return to health felt like the lifting of a curse, a sign that perhaps their fortunes were changing for the better. But not everyone shared in the general rejoicing. Erica began to notice that his brother Bjorn seemed troubled by the sudden transformation, though he could not immediately understand why. Bjorn had always been supportive during the worst of the illness, visiting regularly and offering encouragement. Now, however, there was a distance in his manner, a coolness that had not been there before. The reason became clear one evening when Bjorn appeared at Erica's door, his expression stormy and his words sharp with barely controlled anger. "We need to talk, brother," he said without preamble, pushing past Erica into the longhouse. Elthryth, who had been preparing the evening meal, immediately sensed the tension and moved to withdraw, but Bjorn stopped her with a gesture. "No, stay," he said. "This concerns you as well, I think." Erica felt a prickle of unease. "What is this about, Bjorn?" His brother turned to face him, his arms crossed over his chest, in a posture that radiated hostility. "It is about your miraculous recovery," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "About how you were at death's door one day and fighting fit the next. About how this remarkable change coincided exactly with your acquisition of a certain English thrall who supposedly has healing knowledge. I fail to see how my health is any concern of yours," Erica replied, keeping his voice level despite the anger that was beginning to rise within him. "No concern of mine?" Bjorn's voice rose. "I am your brother, Erica. For 2 years, I have watched you suffer, have stood by helplessly as you grew weaker and weaker. Every healer in the region has tried to help you. Every remedy has been attempted, and nothing worked. Then this woman appears, and suddenly you are cured? Do you take me for a fool?" Elthryth stepped forward, her chin raised in that defiant gesture Erica had come to recognize. "If you have something to say to me, Bjorn Thorsteinsson, then say it directly rather than making accusations through implication." Bjorn turned to her, his eyes blazing. "Very well. What did you do to him? What English sorcery or trickery have you employed? Because I do not believe for one moment that a simple change in diet could accomplish what our best healers could not." Then you are as ignorant as those healers. Elthrith shot back, her own temper flaring. There is no sorcery involved, no trickery. Only observation and knowledge passed down from my mother, who understood that the body sometimes reacts badly to certain foods. Your brother's illness was caused by grain consumption. Remove the grain, remove the illness. It is that simple. Nothing is that simple, Bjorn insisted. And even if what you say is true, it raises questions. Why would you help him? You are a thrall, a captive whose family was killed by our people. You should want him to suffer, not heal. What are you really after? What game are you playing? The accusation hung in the air, ugly and poisonous. Eriker saw Elthrith flinch as if she had been struck, saw the hurt flash across her face before she masked it with anger. I helped him because I could, she said, her voice shaking slightly. Because I saw suffering that I had the knowledge to alleviate. Because despite everything that has been done to me, I am not so consumed by hatred that I would stand by and watch someone die when I could prevent it. How noble, Bjorn sneered. Forgive me if I find that explanation difficult to believe. Enough! Eriker's voice cracked like a whip, silencing his brother. You have no right to come into my home and make such accusations. Elthrith has done nothing but help me, asking for nothing in return. If you cannot accept that at face value, then the problem lies with you, not with her. Bjorn stared at his brother, and something shifted in his expression. The anger remained, but beneath it, Eriker now saw something else. Fear, and perhaps a touch of jealousy. Can you not see what is happening? Bjorn asked, his voice dropping to a more reasonable volume. You are becoming dependent on her, trusting her with your life and your health. She is a thrall, Eriker, a foreigner and a captive. What happens when she decides to stop helping you? What happens if her true loyalties lie elsewhere? The confrontation with Bjorn left a bitter taste in Eriker's mouth that lingered long after his brother had stormed out of the longhouse. He stood in the center of the room, his fists clenched at his sides, trying to process the tangle of emotions that churned within him. Anger at Bjorn's accusations, certainly, but also a nagging doubt that he hated himself for feeling. Was his brother right to question Elthrith's motives? Could there be some hidden agenda behind her willingness to help him? He turned to look at Elthrith and found her standing by the hearth, her posture rigid and her face carefully blank. But he could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands trembled slightly as she folded them in front of her. The confrontation had affected her more deeply than she was willing to show, and Eriker felt a surge of protectiveness that surprised him with its intensity. I apologize for my brother's behavior, Eriker said, moving closer to her. His words were uncalled for and unjust. You have done nothing to deserve such treatment. Elthrith's carefully maintained composure cracked slightly, and when she spoke, her voice carried a weariness that went beyond mere physical exhaustion. Perhaps he is right to question my motives, she said quietly. Perhaps it does seem strange that I would help the son of the people who destroyed my life. I have asked myself the same question many times since that first day when I saw you suffering. And what answer did you find? Eriker asked, genuinely curious about what drove this woman who continued to surprise him at every turn. She was silent for a long moment, her green eyes distant as she gathered her thoughts. I found that I am still the person my mother raised me to be, she finally said. She taught me that healing was not just a skill but a calling, a responsibility to use my knowledge to help others regardless of who they were or what they had done. When I saw you in pain, when I recognized the symptoms of an ailment I knew how to treat, I could not simply stand by and do nothing. It would have been a betrayal of everything she taught me, everything she believed in. Elthrith turned to face him fully, and Eriker saw tears glistening in her eyes, though none fell. But there is more to it than that, she continued, her voice gaining strength. I have lost everything. My home, my family, my freedom, my future. I could let that loss turn me into something bitter and hateful, could let it consume me until there is nothing left of who I once was. Or I can choose to hold on to the parts of myself that matter, the values and principles that define me. Helping you was a way of proving to myself that I am still Elthrith, daughter of Edmund the merchant and Edith the healer, and not just some nameless thrall whose entire identity has been stripped away. The raw honesty of her words struck Eriker with unexpected force. He had never considered what it might be like to lose everything that gave life meaning and structure, to be torn from the context that defined one's place in the world. His own suffering, as intense as it had been, was nothing compared to the totality of what Elthryth had endured. Yet instead of being destroyed by it, she had found a way to preserve her essential self, to maintain her dignity and purpose in the face of overwhelming loss. "You are remarkable," Eriker said, the words emerging before he could consider whether they were appropriate. "Truly remarkable. I have known warriors who crumbled under far less pressure than you have faced, who lost themselves in bitterness and despair. Yet you remain strong, remain true to yourself. That takes a courage that I am not sure I possess." Elthryth looked away, seeming uncomfortable with the praise. "I am not as strong as you think," she said. "There are nights when I lie awake and wonder if I should have fought harder when your people attacked our village, if I should have died alongside my parents rather than allowing myself to be taken captive. There are days when the weight of everything I have lost feels so heavy that I can barely breathe. But I wake up each morning and choose to continue, because the alternative is to surrender completely, and I am not ready to do that." Eriker found himself moving closer to her, drawn by an impulse he did not fully understand. "You will never have to surrender," he said firmly, "not while you are under my protection. And I give you my word, Elthryth, that I will do everything in my power to make your life here as bearable as possible. You have given me back my health, my future. I owe you a debt that I can never fully repay." She met his gaze, and something passed between them in that moment, a connection that transcended the rigid boundaries of master and thrall. Eriker saw her not as a possession or even as a servant, but as a person of depth and complexity, someone worthy of respect and admiration. And in Elthryth's eyes, he thought he detected a softening, a cautious willingness to trust that had not been there before. The moment was broken by another knock at the door, and Eriker stepped back, suddenly aware of how close he had been standing to Elthryth. He called for the visitor to enter, and a young boy from the settlement burst in, his face flushed from running in the cold. "Eriker Thornson," the boy gasped, trying to catch his breath. "Your father requests your presence immediately. A messenger has arrived from Jarl Ragnvald." "The Jarl will be here in 3 days' time, not next month as was previously announced. Your father is calling an emergency council meeting." The news sent a jolt of alarm through Eriker. 3 days was barely enough time to prepare for such an important visit, and the change in schedule suggested that whatever Ragnvald wanted, it was urgent. He thanked the boy and sent him on his way, then quickly gathered his cloak and weapons. "I must go," he told Elthryth. "I do not know how long this meeting will last, but do not wait up for me. Get some rest." "Be careful," Elthryth said, and Eriker was touched by the genuine concern in her voice. Political meetings can be as dangerous as battlefields, in their own way. He smiled at the observation. Wise words. I will remember them. The emergency council meeting stretched late into the night, with tempers running high and opinions divided on how to respond to Ragnvald's unexpected early arrival. Some argued that it was a sign of aggression, an attempt to catch Bjornheim unprepared and off balance. Others suggested it might indicate that Ragnvald faced some crisis of his own and needed to secure an alliance quickly. Without more information, it was impossible to know for certain. What everyone agreed on was that the visit represented a critical juncture for the settlement. How they handled Ragnvald and whatever proposal he brought could determine Bjornheim's future for years to come. Thorstein, displaying the wisdom and experience that had kept him in power for decades, counseled caution and preparation. "We will receive Ragnvald with all the hospitality and honor due to a fellow Jarl," Thorstein declared. "Our storerooms will be opened, our best food and drink provided. We will show him a settlement that is prosperous and well-governed, a community of strong, capable people who would make valuable allies but formidable enemies. Whatever he proposes, we will listen with respect, but commit to nothing until we have had time to consider all implications." The following 3 days passed in a whirlwind of activity. The entire settlement mobilized to prepare for Ragnvald's visit. The great hall was cleaned and decorated, fresh rushes laid on the floor, the best tapestries hung on the walls. Hunting parties were dispatched to bring in fresh game, and the women of the settlement worked from dawn until well past dark preparing bread, roasting meat, and brewing vast quantities of ale and mead. Eriker threw himself into the preparations with an energy that astonished everyone who had witnessed his previous weakness. He helped organize the younger warriors, supervised the repair of damaged buildings that Ragnvald might see, and even participated in the hunt that brought down a massive boar for the welcoming feast. His transformation from invalid to vigorous leader was complete, and it did not go unnoticed. In the evenings, when Eriker returned to his longhouse, exhausted from the day's labors, he found Elthryth waiting with carefully prepared meals that contained no grain but were nonetheless filling and flavorful. She had proven remarkably creative in adapting traditional Norse dishes to accommodate his dietary restrictions, and Eriker found himself actually enjoying food again, rather than simply enduring it out of necessity. They fell into a pattern of conversation during these evening meals, and Eriker discovered that he looked forward to these quiet hours more than almost anything else in his day. Elthryth had opinions on nearly everything, from the best way to preserve meat for the winter to the political complexities of the upcoming visit. Her insights were often surprisingly astute, offering perspectives that Eriker had not considered. On the evening before Ragnvald's scheduled arrival, as they sat together by the fire, Eriker found himself telling Elthryth things he had shared with no one else. He spoke of his fears about leadership, his doubts about whether he possessed the wisdom and skill necessary to guide Bjornheim when his father eventually passed. He confessed his frustration with the rigid expectations placed upon him, the way his entire life had been mapped out from birth with little regard for his own desires or preferences. Elthryth listened without judgment, offering neither empty reassurance nor harsh criticism. When he finally fell silent, she said simply, "Leadership is not about having all the answers or being perfect. It is about caring enough about your people to always strive to do what is best for them, even when the right course is unclear. From what I have seen, Eriker, you possess that quality in abundance. The rest can be learned." Her words, spoken with quiet conviction, eased something in Eriker's chest that he had not realized was constricted. "How did you become so wise?" he asked with a slight smile. "Suffering teaches lessons that comfort never can," Elthryth replied, "and I have had more than my share of suffering to learn from." The moment was interrupted by yet another knock at the door, and Eriker suppressed a sigh of frustration. It seemed he could not have a single uninterrupted conversation with Elthryth. This time it was his mother, Astrid, who entered when he called permission. Astrid was a formidable woman in her own right, still handsome in her middle years, with iron-gray hair braided in an elaborate style and sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. She had been a Jarl's daughter before marrying Thorstein, and she carried herself with the authority of someone born to command. Her gaze immediately found Elthryth, studying the Englishwoman with an intensity that made even Eriker shift uncomfortably. "Mother," he greeted her, rising to his feet. "What brings you here at this late hour?" "I came to speak with you about tomorrow," Astrid said, though her eyes remained fixed on Elthryth. "But I see you have company. This must be the English thrall everyone is talking about." Elthryth stood as well, her posture respectful but not servile. "I am Elthryth, my lady," she said, her Norse now quite fluent after weeks of daily use. "Elthryth," Astrid repeated, moving closer to examine her more carefully. "I have heard interesting things about you. Some say you possess healing knowledge. Others suggest you have bewitched my son with foreign magic. Which is true?" "Mother!" Eriker protested, shocked by the directness of the accusation. But Elthryth seemed unperturbed. "I possess knowledge of healing passed down from my mother, who was a respected healer in our region of England," she said calmly. "As for bewitching your son, I have no such abilities, nor would I use them if I did. I have simply helped Eriker identify a dietary problem that was causing his illness. There is no magic involved, only observation and common sense." Astrid continued to study her for a long, uncomfortable moment. Then, to Eriker's surprise, his mother's stern expression softened slightly. "I see. And you did this out of what motivation exactly? Surely not simple kindness toward your captors." "I did it because it was within my power to help, and I was raised to believe that those with healing knowledge have an obligation to use it," Elthryth replied. "My feelings about my captivity are complex, but they do not override my sense of duty to my calling." Something in Astrid's expression shifted, and Eriker recognized the look of grudging respect that his mother reserved for those few people who managed to impress her. "A noble sentiment," Astrid said, "and one that speaks well of your upbringing, despite your foreign origins." She turned to Eriker. "You have chosen an unusual thrall, my son, but perhaps an unusually valuable one as well." She settled herself on one of the benches, clearly intending to stay for a while. "Now, about tomorrow," she continued. shifting back to her original purpose. Ragnvald will arrive with a large retinue, including his daughter Sigrid. I have met the girl on previous occasions, and she is both beautiful and accomplished. It would not surprise me if Ragnvald proposes a marriage alliance between her and you, Erikr. The words hit Erikr like a physical blow, though he tried not to show it. He had known this was a possibility, had discussed it during the council meetings, but hearing his mother state it so baldly made it feel suddenly, uncomfortably real. He glanced at Elthrith and saw that her expression had gone carefully blank, revealing nothing of her thoughts. Such an alliance would be advantageous for both settlements, Astrid continued, seemingly unaware of her son's internal turmoil. Sigrid would bring a substantial dowry, and the connection to Ragnvald's power would secure Bjornheim's position in the region. Your father and I believe it is an opportunity worth serious consideration. And what of my opinion on the matter? Erikr asked, hearing the edge in his own voice. Am I to have no say in who I marry? Astrid's eyes narrowed. You are the Jarl's heir, Erikr. Your marriage is not merely a personal matter, but a political decision that affects everyone in this settlement. You have always known this would be the case. Why do you suddenly object to what has always been understood? It was a fair question, and Erikr found he had no good answer for it. Or rather, he had an answer that he could not give, not with his mother sitting right there watching him with those perceptive eyes. The truth was that something had changed in recent weeks, something fundamental in how he viewed his future and what he wanted from it, and that change was directly connected to the woman standing quietly by the hearth, the English thrall who had saved his life and somehow, without either of them intending it, had begun to claim a piece of his heart. Jarl Ragnvald arrived at Bjornheim with the rising sun, his longships cutting through the morning mist like predatory sea beasts emerging from the depths. Erikr stood on the shore alongside his father and the assembled warriors of the settlement, watching as the vessels beached themselves on the rocky strand. The display was clearly calculated to impress. Ragnvald had brought 3 ships, each larger and more ornately decorated than any vessel Bjornheim possessed, their dragon-headed prows gleaming with fresh paint, and their sails bearing intricate designs that proclaimed their owner's wealth and power. Ragnvald himself was the first to disembark, a man of perhaps 40 winters with a thick black beard shot through with silver and eyes the color of storm clouds. He was shorter than Erikr, but massively built, his shoulders nearly as wide as a doorframe, and his arms thick with muscle despite his age. He carried himself with the absolute confidence of someone who had never doubted his right to command, and the warriors who followed him down the gangplank moved with the disciplined precision of men who had fought together in countless battles. Thorstein! Ragnvald's voice boomed across the beach, hearty and seemingly friendly. It has been too long since we last met, old friend. I hope my early arrival has not inconvenienced you too greatly. Not at all, Ragnvald, Thorstein replied, stepping forward to clasp forearms with his fellow Jarl in the traditional greeting. Bjornheim is always prepared to welcome honored guests, regardless of when they might arrive. Your presence brings honor to our settlement. The 2 Jarls exchanged pleasantries while Erikr studied the rest of Ragnvald's party. There were perhaps 30 warriors in total, all well-armed and bearing the weathered look of experienced fighters. But his attention was quickly drawn to a woman who had just emerged from the lead ship, and he knew immediately that this must be Sigrid, Ragnvald's daughter. She was undeniably beautiful, with hair the color of honey that fell in elaborate braids to her waist and features that were both delicate and proud. She wore a dress of fine blue wool decorated with intricate embroidery, and silver jewelry adorned her neck and arms. Everything about her proclaimed wealth, status, and careful cultivation. She moved with practiced grace as her father's warriors helped her navigate the rocky beach, and when her eyes found Erikr, she smiled in a way that was both demure and calculating. Erikr felt his stomach tighten, though not with the pain that had plagued him for so long. This was a different kind of discomfort, the recognition that he was being evaluated as a potential husband, assessed for his suitability to join with Ragnvald's bloodline and political ambitions. He returned Sigrid's smile with a polite nod, knowing that courtesy demanded nothing less, but feeling trapped by the inexorable momentum of expectations and tradition. The procession from the beach to the settlement was conducted with formal ceremony. Thorstein led the way with Ragnvald at his side. The 2 men engaged in conversation that appeared casual, but was surely anything but. Erikr walked with Bjorn and several other prominent warriors, very aware of Sigrid's presence just behind them, her eyes frequently finding him when he glanced back. The great hall had been transformed for the occasion. Every surface gleamed from vigorous cleaning. The best tapestries depicting scenes of heroic battles and legendary voyages hung on the walls, and the long tables were already laden with food and drink. A fire roared in the central hearth, driving back the winter cold and filling the space with warmth and flickering light. The people of Bjornheim had assembled to witness the arrival, and their faces showed a mixture of curiosity and apprehension as they waited to learn what this visit would bring. Thorstein seated Ragnvald in the place of honor beside his own high seat, with Sigrid positioned nearby. Eiríkur found himself placed directly across from Sigrid, an arrangement that was clearly deliberate. As the welcoming feast began, with servants bringing forth platters of roasted meat, fresh bread, cheese, and endless horns of mead, Eiríkur became increasingly aware that he was the focus of intense scrutiny from both Ragnvald and his daughter. The conversation during the meal was carefully neutral, touching on safe topics like the success of recent hunts, the quality of the winter weather, and news from other settlements in the region. But beneath the surface pleasantries, Eiríkur could feel the tension building, the sense that everyone was waiting for the real purpose of the visit to be revealed. He caught his father's eye several times and saw the same wariness reflected there. Eiríkur had arranged for his meals to be prepared separately, claiming a slight stomach ailment that required bland food, and so while others consumed the grain-heavy feast, he ate from dishes that Elthrith had prepared that morning following his dietary restrictions. He saw Ragnvald notice this and frown slightly, and Eiríkur felt a flash of anxiety that his careful recovery might be undone by suspicions about his health. But Sigrid seemed more interested than concerned. "I heard you were recently ill," she said, her voice cultured and pleasant. "But you appear to have made a remarkable recovery. You look strong and vital, nothing like the reports that reached our settlement." "The reports were accurate at the time they were made," Eiríkur replied carefully, "but I have been fortunate enough to discover the cause of my illness and address it. I am much improved now." "How wonderful," Sigrid said, and her smile widened. "There is nothing worse than seeing a strong warrior brought low by mysterious ailments. I am glad to see you restored to health." She paused, then added with a coyness that was clearly practiced, "A settlement needs a strong heir to secure its future. I am sure your father is greatly relieved." The implication was clear, and Eiríkur felt his jaw tighten. He was being sized up like a prize bull at a trading fair, evaluated for his fitness to breed strong children who would unite two powerful bloodlines. The crudeness of it, disguised beneath layers of polite conversation and social niceties, made him want to reject the entire premise, but he was trapped by duty and expectation, forced to play out this elaborate dance regardless of his personal feelings. As the feast continued, Eiríkur found his thoughts drifting to Elthrith, wondering what she was doing at that moment. She had remained in his longhouse, as was appropriate for a thrall during such an important occasion, but he missed her presence with an intensity that surprised him. He missed her direct way of speaking, her intelligence, the sense of genuine connection that had developed between them. Next to that, Sigrid's calculated charm felt hollow and false, a performance rather than authentic interaction. Finally, as the meal drew to a close and the tables were cleared to make room for drinking and storytelling, Ragnvald rose to his feet. The hall fell silent immediately, all eyes turning to the visiting Jarl as he prepared to speak. "Thorstein," Ragnvald began, his voice carrying easily through the space. "You and I have known each other for many years. We have traded together, fought side by side against common enemies, and always maintained a relationship of mutual respect. Our settlements have prospered independently, but the world is changing. The Saxon kingdoms to the south grow stronger and more unified. Other jarls consolidate power and form alliances. The time of small, isolated settlements acting alone is coming to an end." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "I propose that we formalize the friendship between our settlements with a marriage alliance. My daughter Sigrid is of age and accomplished in all the skills required of a jarl's wife. Your son Eiríkur is a renowned warrior and your chosen heir. A union between them would bind our families and create a partnership that would make both our settlements stronger and more secure." The proposal, though expected, still sent a ripple of reaction through the assembled crowd. Eiríkur felt as if the walls of the hall were closing in on him, as if he were being backed into a corner from which there was no escape. He looked at his father and saw Thorstein's expression carefully neutral, revealing nothing of his thoughts. This is a generous offer, Thorstein said after a measured pause, one that deserves serious consideration, but such important decisions should not be made hastily. Perhaps we might discuss this matter in more detail tomorrow, after we have all had time to reflect on the implications. Ragnvald's smile did not quite reach his eyes. Of course. I would not dream of rushing such an important decision. But perhaps Eiríkur and Sigrid might spend some time together tomorrow, getting to know one another. After all, a marriage, even a political one, works best when the parties involved have some mutual regard. Before Eiríkur could formulate a response, Sigrid spoke up. "I would be delighted to spend time with Eiríkur," she said, her voice sweet but her eyes calculating. "Perhaps he could show me around Bjornheim, introduce me to your settlement's ways." Eiríkur found himself agreeing, though every instinct screamed against it. To refuse would be an insult to both Sigrid and her father, would undermine his own father's diplomatic efforts. So he smiled and nodded and said all the appropriate things while internally feeling like a prisoner watching the door to his cell slam shut. The feast continued late into the night, with the drinking growing heavier and the stories more boisterous. Eiríkur participated as required, but his heart was not in it. As soon as he could politely extract himself, he made his excuses and left the hall, stepping out into the cold night air with a sense of relief. The walk back to his longhouse seemed longer than usual, and Eiríkur found himself dreading what the next day would bring. He would have to spend time with Sigrid, would have to pretend interest and enthusiasm for a match that felt increasingly wrong, and all the while Elthrith would be there in his home, a constant reminder of what he was beginning to realize he truly wanted but could never have. When he entered the longhouse, he found Elthrith still awake, sitting by the fire with some mending in her lap. She looked up as he entered, and he saw the question in her eyes even though she did not voice it. "The feast went as expected," Eiríkur said, moving to warm himself by the fire. "Ragnvald has proposed a marriage between myself and his daughter. My father has agreed to consider it." He saw Elthrith's hand still on the fabric she had been working on, saw something flash across her face too quickly for him to identify. "I see," she said quietly. "That is quite an honor, I am sure. She is very beautiful." "Yes," Eiríkur agreed, hearing the flatness in his own voice. "She is beautiful and accomplished and exactly the sort of wife a Jarl's son should have." Elthrith set aside her mending and stood, moving to prepare a cup of herbal tea that had become part of his evening routine. As she handed it to him, their fingers brushed, and Eiríkur felt a jolt of connection that was entirely absent from his interactions with Sigrid. "You do not sound pleased," Elthrith observed, her green eyes searching his face. Eiríkur took a sip of the tea, using the moment to gather his thoughts. "I am not pleased," he admitted. "But my pleasure or displeasure is irrelevant. I am the Jarl's heir, and my marriage will be decided by political considerations, not personal preference. This has always been my destiny." "That seems a harsh way to live," Elthrith said softly. "To have no say in something as fundamental as who you will spend your life with. It is the price of privilege and position," Eiríkur replied, though the words tasted bitter. "I have wealth, status, power, that most men can only dream of. In exchange, I sacrifice the freedom to choose my own path." He looked at her directly. "At least I know what to expect. You had your freedom and your choices stolen from you without warning, without any compensation for the loss." Elthrith moved back to her seat, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. The fire crackled and popped, sending shadows dancing across the walls, and outside, the wind picked up, howling around the corners of the longhouse. "Can I tell you something?" Elthrith finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Something I probably should not say?" "You can tell me anything," Eiríkur assured her, moving to sit across from her. She took a breath, seeming to steel herself. "These past weeks, living here, working with you, talking with you each evening, it has been the closest I have felt to being myself since I was captured. You treat me not as a thrall but as a person. You listen to my opinions, value my knowledge, respect my dignity, and I find myself caring about what happens to you, about your happiness and your future, which is foolish, I know, because I am your slave and you are far above my station, and soon you will be married to a beautiful Norse woman, and my role in your life will diminish to nothing but—" She trailed off, seeming to realize she had said too much. Eiríkur stared at her, his heart pounding as he processed her words. She cared about him. She had just admitted, as clearly as was possible without being explicit, that her feelings had moved beyond simple gratitude or duty, and the revelation filled him with a fierce joy that was immediately followed by crushing despair, because what could possibly come of such feelings? She was right that they were foolish, that the gap between their positions was insurmountable. He was a Jarl's son, destined to marry for political advantage and produce heirs who would carry on his family's legacy. She was a foreign thrall, a captive with no status or power. There was no future for them, no possibility of anything beyond the friendship that had already pushed the boundaries of propriety. But even knowing all of that, Eiríkur could not deny the truth that burned in his chest. He cared for Elthrith too. Somewhere in the past weeks, she had become more important to him than his own health, his own future. The thought of marrying Sigrid while knowing that Elthrith would remain in his household, a constant reminder of what might have been, was almost unbearable. "Elthrith," he began, but was interrupted by another knock at the door. The persistent knocking shattered the intimate moment, and Eiríkur felt a surge of frustration at yet another interruption. He exchanged a quick glance with Ealhthryth, seeing his own disappointment reflected in her eyes, before calling out permission for the visitor to enter. The door swung open to reveal Bjorn, his face flushed from drink and his expression troubled. "Brother," Bjorn said, stumbling slightly as he crossed the threshold, "I need to speak with you. It cannot wait until morning." Eiríkur gestured for him to sit, noting that Ealhthryth had already retreated to the sleeping alcove to give them privacy. Once Bjorn had settled onto one of the benches, Eiríkur poured him a cup of water, recognizing that his brother had consumed more mead than was wise. "What is so urgent that it brings you here at this hour?" Eiríkur asked, sitting down across from his brother. Bjorn took a long drink of water, then set the cup down with enough force to make it clatter against the wooden table. "I came to apologize," he said, his words slightly slurred but his tone sincere. "For what I said about your thrall, about questioning her motives. I was wrong, Eiríkur. Wrong and jealous and foolish." The admission caught Eiríkur off guard. "Jealous?" he repeated. "Of what?" "Of everything," Bjorn replied, his voice growing thick with emotion. "Of the fact that you are father's heir, that you will be Jarl after him while I will always be second, always in your shadow. And when you fell ill, I am ashamed to say that a part of me was almost glad, because it meant that maybe, just maybe, father would turn to me instead. I would have my chance to prove myself, to be the son who mattered." He ran a hand through his hair, his expression miserable. "But then you recovered, came back stronger than ever, and I realized how petty and small my thoughts had been. You are my brother, Eiríkur. I should have been overjoyed by your recovery, should have celebrated with you instead of questioning and doubting. Instead, I acted like a jealous child, lashing out at the person who had helped you because I resented the fact that it was not me who had found the solution." Eiríkur felt a wave of compassion for his brother, recognizing the pain that lay beneath the admission. He had never fully appreciated how difficult it must be for Bjorn to live in his shadow, to know that no matter what he accomplished, he would always be the younger son, the spare rather than the heir. "You have nothing to apologize for," Eiríkur said gently. "Well, perhaps the way you spoke to Ealhthryth deserves an apology, but your feelings about our positions are understandable. I would likely feel the same if our situations were reversed." "Would you, though?" Bjorn asked, looking up with red-rimmed eyes. "You have always been so noble, so honorable. I doubt you would have harbored such dark thoughts about your own brother." "You give me too much credit," Eiríkur replied. "I am far from perfect, Bjorn. I have my own weaknesses and failings, my own moments of pettiness and selfishness. The difference is that mine are less visible because I am expected to hide them better." They talked for a long while, the barrier of formality and unexpressed resentment that had grown between them gradually dissolving as they spoke with more honesty than they had in years. Bjorn confessed that he had never wanted to be Jarl anyway, that the responsibility terrified him. Eiríkur admitted that he sometimes resented the burden of expectation, the way his entire life had been predetermined by the accident of his birth order. "And now this business with Ragnvald's daughter," Bjorn said, once he had sobered somewhat. "I saw your face during the feast, brother. You looked like a man being led to his execution, rather than being offered a beautiful bride." Eiríkur hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. But the newfound openness between them encouraged honesty. "Sigrid is everything I should want in a wife," he said carefully. "She is beautiful, accomplished, well connected. The alliance would strengthen Bjornheim's position immeasurably. And yet your heart lies elsewhere. Bjorn finished for him, his eyes darting toward the sleeping alcove where Elthrith had disappeared, with the English thrall. Erikr wanted to deny it, to maintain the pretense that his relationship with Elthrith was purely practical, but the words would not come. Instead, he simply nodded, feeling the weight of the admission settle over him. Bjorn was quiet for a moment, then said, "That is a dangerous path, brother. You know as well as I do that nothing can come of such feelings. The gap between your positions is too great, and even if it were not, Father would never allow you to marry a foreign thrall when political necessity demands an alliance." "I know," Erikr said, his voice heavy with resignation. "Believe me, I know. But knowing does not make the feelings disappear. It only makes them more painful." "Then what will you do?" Bjorn asked. "Will you marry Sigrid and try to forget about Elthrith? Will you keep them both, taking Sigrid as your wife and Elthrith as your, what? Your mistress? Your confidant?" The suggestions made Erikr's stomach turn. The thought of marrying Sigrid while maintaining some sort of clandestine relationship with Elthrith seemed sordid and disrespectful to both women. Elthrith deserved better than to be relegated to the shadows, to be the secret that could never be acknowledged. And Sigrid, whatever her faults, deserved a husband who came to her freely, not one whose heart belonged to another. "I do not know what I will do," Erikr admitted. "All I know is that tomorrow I must spend the day with Sigrid, must play the role of interested suitor, while my heart rebels against the entire charade. And then, eventually I will have to make a choice that will determine the course of the rest of my life." Bjorn stood, steadier now that the effects of the mead had begun to fade. "I wish I had wisdom to offer you, brother, but I am as lost as you are when it comes to matters of the heart. All I can say is that I support whatever decision you make, and I am sorry for adding to your burdens with my jealousy and suspicion." After Bjorn left, Erikr sat alone for a long time, staring into the dying embers of the fire and wrestling with thoughts that offered no easy resolution. Finally, he rose and moved to the sleeping alcove, intending to retire for the night. He found Elthrith still awake, lying on her pallet with her eyes open, staring at the ceiling. "You heard?" he asked quietly. "Some of it," she admitted. "Your brother's voice carries, especially when he has been drinking." Erikr sat down on the edge of his bed, close enough to speak quietly but maintaining a respectful distance. "Elthrith, about what you said earlier, before Bjorn arrived." "Please," she interrupted, her voice strained. "Do not make me repeat it. It was foolish of me to speak so openly. I overstepped the bounds of my position, and I apologize." "You have nothing to apologize for," Erikr said firmly. "And I need you to know that your feelings are not one-sided. These past weeks with you have been the happiest I can remember. Your intelligence, your courage, your kindness, they have shown me what true companionship could be. And the thought of marrying Sigrid while knowing what I am giving up is almost more than I can bear." Elthrith sat up, her expression a mixture of hope and despair. "But we both know there is no future for us," she said. "Even if you wanted to marry me, which is impossible given our respective positions, your duty to your family and your settlement must come first. A Jarl's son cannot marry a foreign thrall, no matter what his heart might desire." "I know," Erikr said, the words feeling like ashes in his mouth. "And yet knowing does not make it any easier to accept." They looked at each other across the small space that separated them, and Erikr felt the pull of attraction so strongly that it was almost physical. It would be so easy to close the distance between them, to give in to the feelings that had been building for weeks. But he knew that doing so would only make the eventual separation more painful, would create complications that neither of them could afford. "We should sleep," he said finally, forcing himself to stand and move back to his own bed. "Tomorrow will be difficult enough without adding exhaustion to our burdens." Elthrith nodded, though he saw the shimmer of tears in her eyes. "Good night, Erikr," she whispered. "Good night, Elthrith." The next morning dawned gray and cold, with snow falling steadily from a sky that seemed to mirror Erikr's mood. He dressed with care, choosing his finest tunic and cloak, and allowed Elthrith to help him with the elaborate braiding of his beard that formal occasions required. Her fingers were gentle as they worked, and he treasured each moment of contact, knowing that such intimacy would become increasingly rare once he was married. Sigrid arrived at his longhouse mid-morning, accompanied by 2 of her father's warriors, who remained outside to provide a semblance of propriety. She swept in wearing a cloak lined with fox fur and a dress of deep green that complemented her coloring beautifully. Her eyes immediately found Elthryth, and Erica saw a flash of something that might have been disdain or perhaps calculation cross her face. "Good morning, Erica," Sigrid said warmly, moving to his side and placing a possessive hand on his arm. "I hope you slept well. I was so excited about spending today with you that I barely slept at all." The statement rang false to Erica's ears, too perfectly calculated to seem genuine, but he forced a smile and replied appropriately. "I am honored by your enthusiasm, my lady. I thought perhaps I could show you some of Bjornheim's most notable features, if the weather permits." As they prepared to leave, Erica caught Elthryth's eye and saw the pain there, carefully masked but unmistakable to someone who had learned to read her expressions. He wanted to say something, to offer some word of comfort or reassurance, but Sigrid's presence made that impossible. Instead, he simply held her gaze for a moment longer than necessary, trying to convey with his eyes what he could not speak aloud. The tour of Bjornheim was exactly as tedious as Erica had anticipated. Sigrid exclaimed over everything with what seemed like excessive enthusiasm, asking questions that demonstrated either genuine ignorance or feigned interest. She touched his arm frequently, laughed at things that were not particularly amusing, and generally behaved like a woman determined to secure a husband through charm and persistence. They visited the harbor, where Sigrid expressed admiration for Bjornheim's ships despite them being clearly inferior to her father's vessels. They toured the settlement's largest farm, where Sigrid claimed to be fascinated by the agricultural techniques employed, though Erica suspected she had never given farming a moment's thought in her privileged life. They even climbed to a vantage point that offered a view of the surrounding landscape, and Sigrid declared it the most beautiful sight she had ever seen, despite the fact that the snow reduced visibility to almost nothing. Through it all, Erica played his role as the attentive potential husband, responding to Sigrid's comments and questions with appropriate courtesy. But his mind kept drifting back to his longhouse, to the woman waiting there who represented everything he truly wanted but could never have. As they walked back toward the settlement's center, Sigrid suddenly stopped and turned to face him, her expression becoming more serious. "Erica," she said, her voice dropping the artificial sweetness that had characterized it all morning. "I think we should speak plainly, you and I. This courtship, this pretense of getting to know one another, it serves no real purpose. We both know why I am here and what is expected of us." The directness surprised Erica, and he found himself appreciating it despite everything. "Go on," he said carefully. "My father wants this alliance, and your father is inclined to accept it," Sigrid continued. "A marriage between us would benefit both our families and both our settlements. I am prepared to be a good wife to you, to manage your household, bear your children, and support your position as Jarl when the time comes. I do not expect love, though I hope we might develop mutual respect and perhaps even affection over time." She paused, studying his face intently. "But I am not blind, Erica. I saw how you looked at that English thrall this morning, and I saw how she looked at you. There is something between you, whether acted upon or not, and I need to know, if we marry, will you be able to put aside whatever feelings you have for her and commit yourself fully to our union?" The question hung between them, and Erica found himself respecting Sigrid more in that moment than he had during their entire acquaintance. She was not the simpering, shallow woman she had pretended to be earlier. She was intelligent and observant, capable of honest assessment of the situation. "I will not lie to you," Erica said slowly. "Yes, I have developed feelings for Elthryth, but I also understand my duty and my responsibility. If I marry you, I will honor that commitment and do everything in my power to be the husband you deserve." Sigrid studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, to Erica's complete surprise, she laughed, though there was little humor in the sound. "You are more honest than most men would be in your position," she said. "Most would simply lie, promise devotion they do not feel, and then keep their thrall as a mistress while maintaining the facade of a proper marriage. I appreciate your candor, even if the truth is not what I might have hoped to hear." She turned away from him, gazing out at the snow-covered settlement. "Can I tell you a secret, Erica? Something I have told no one else?" When he nodded, she continued, "I do not want this marriage any more than you do. Oh, I understand its political value, and I am prepared to go through with it if necessary. But there is someone else. a warrior in my father's service, whom I have loved since I was 15 winters old. He is brave and kind and everything I could want in a husband, but he has no wealth or status, nothing that would make him an acceptable match for a jarl's daughter. The revelation shifted everything, and Eiríkur felt an unexpected kinship with this woman he had been viewing as an obstacle to his happiness. They were both trapped by the same forces of duty and expectation, both suffering from hearts that wanted what politics could not allow. "What is his name?" Eiríkur asked gently. "Ragnar," Sigrid replied, and her face softened as she spoke it. "He accompanied us on this journey, though he has been careful to maintain his distance. My father knows of my feelings and disapproves, of course. He sees Ragnar as a useful warrior, but nothing more. The idea of his daughter marrying someone of such low status is unthinkable to him." They stood together in silence for a moment, two people bound by circumstances beyond their control. Then Sigrid turned back to face him, and he saw a new determination in her eyes. "Perhaps," she said carefully, "there is another way. A solution that would satisfy our father's political needs while allowing us both to pursue our true desires." "What do you mean?" Eiríkur asked, though a spark of hope was beginning to kindle in his chest. "An alliance between our settlements does not necessarily require a marriage between us specifically," Sigrid said, speaking quickly now as the idea took shape. "What if we could convince our fathers that a different arrangement would serve their interests equally well? Your brother Bjorn, for instance, is also a son of the Jarl, also capable of cementing an alliance through marriage." Eirikyr's mind raced as he considered the implications. "But Ragnvald specifically proposed a marriage between us, between the heir and his daughter. Would he accept Bjorn as a substitute?" "Perhaps not immediately," Sigrid admitted. "But if we were to present a compelling argument, if we could demonstrate that such an arrangement would still achieve his objectives while also addressing certain practical concerns, he might be persuaded." She paused, then added, "And there is another factor to consider. If you were to free your English thrall and legitimize your relationship with her in some way, it might actually strengthen Bjornheim's position." "How so?" Eiríkur asked, puzzled by the suggestion. "Think about it," Sigrid said, warming to her theme. "You have recovered from a mysterious illness that plagued you for 2 years, an illness that no Norse healer could cure. The woman who solved this mystery possesses knowledge that could be valuable to the entire settlement. If you were to elevate her position, to make her a recognized healer rather than just a thrall, you would be demonstrating both gratitude and wisdom. You would be showing that you value ability and knowledge over rigid adherence to social convention." The idea was audacious, perhaps even scandalous, but Eiríkur found himself drawn to it despite the risks. "And you truly believe this could work? That our fathers would accept such a proposal?" "I believe it has a chance," Sigrid replied. "Better than no chance at all, which is what we have if we simply accept the fate they have planned for us. But it will require careful planning and perfect execution. We must present a united front, must show them that this alternative serves their interests better than the original plan." They spent the next hour walking through the settlement, no longer performing the charade of courtship, but instead planning like co-conspirators. Sigrid proved to be remarkably clever, with a strategic mind that impressed Eiríkur despite his preconceptions. Together, they crafted arguments and anticipated objections, building a case that might just be persuasive enough to work. When they finally returned to the center of the settlement, they found that a gathering had been arranged in the Great Hall. Thorstein and Ragnvald sat together in deep discussion, and the atmosphere was tense with expectation. Eiríkur and Sigrid exchanged a glance, and he saw his own nervousness reflected in her eyes. This was the moment when everything would be decided, when they would either succeed in forging their own paths or be swept along by forces beyond their control. Thorstein looked up as they entered, and Eiríkur saw hope and anxiety warring in his father's expression. "Eiríkur, Sigrid," the Jarl greeted them. "We have been discussing the proposed alliance. Ragnvald and I have reached an agreement in principle, subject to your acceptance of the match." "Father," Eiríkur said, his voice steady despite the hammering of his heart. "Before you proceed further, Sigrid and I have something we wish to propose. A different arrangement that we believe would serve both our settlement's interests while also addressing certain practical concerns." Ragnvald's eyes narrowed. "What sort of different arrangement?" he asked, his tone conveying suspicion. Sigrid stepped forward, her posture confident and her voice clear. "Father, Eiríkur and I have spent the day together and we have come to respect one another greatly, but we have also realized that we are not well suited as marriage partners. Our temperaments, our interests, our visions for the future, they do not align in the way that a successful marriage requires. Nonsense, Ragnvald said dismissively. Marriage is not about alignment of temperaments. It is about duty and alliance. With respect, father, I disagree, Sigrid continued, showing a courage that Eiríkur had not expected. A marriage built solely on political considerations, with no foundation of compatibility or mutual regard, is unstable. It may serve short-term goals, but over time, the resentment and unhappiness of the partners will undermine the very alliance it was meant to create. Thorstein leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. What exactly are you proposing? Eiríkur took up the explanation. We propose that the alliance between Bjornheim and Ragnvald's settlement be sealed through a marriage between Sigrid and my brother Bjorn. Bjorn is also a son of the Jarl, also capable of producing heirs who would carry the blood of both families. Such a union would achieve all the political objectives of the original proposal. And what of you, Eiríkur? Thorstein asked. If you do not marry Sigrid, who will you marry? Bjornheim still needs alliances, still needs the connections that a strategic marriage provides. This was the dangerous part, the moment when their careful planning would either succeed or fail catastrophically. Eiríkur took a deep breath and said, I propose to free Elthrith, the English thrall, and to make her my wife. The statement landed like a boulder thrown into a still pond, creating ripples of shock that spread throughout the hall. Ragnvald's face turned red with anger, and several of the assembled warriors began muttering among themselves. Even Thorstein looked stunned, though Eiríkur thought he detected something else in his father's expression as well, something that might have been understanding or perhaps even approval. Have you lost your mind? Ragnvald bellowed, rising to his feet. Marry a thrall? A foreign captive with no status, no family, no dowry? This is madness. Is it? Eiríkur challenged, standing his ground. Elthrith possesses knowledge that saved my life when every healer in the region had failed. She has proven herself intelligent, capable, and loyal. Yes, she was born in England rather than among our people, but what does that matter? Our ancestors came from elsewhere as well, settled these lands that were once foreign to them. Are we so rigid in our thinking that we cannot recognize value simply because it comes from an unexpected source? Thorstein raised his hand, calling for silence. Let him speak, the Jarl commanded. I would hear the rest of his argument before passing judgment. Eiríkur continued, choosing his words with care. For 2 years I was dying. My illness was destroying not just me but also Bjornheim's future, because without a healthy heir, the settlement's stability was in question. Elthrith discovered the cause and provided the cure. In doing so, she demonstrated skills that could benefit our entire community. Imagine having a healer of her caliber permanently attached to Bjornheim, her knowledge available to all who need it. That is worth more than any dowry, more than any political connection. And what of love? Sigrid asked, speaking up in support. Should that count for nothing in the equation? I can testify that Eiríkur and Elthrith have developed genuine regard for one another, the kind of bond that could sustain a marriage through difficult times. My own proposed marriage to Bjorn would be built on similar foundation. Bjorn and I have known each other since childhood, have always gotten along well. We may not love one another romantically, but we have the friendship and mutual respect that can grow into something deeper. Bjorn, who had been silent up to this point, suddenly spoke up. I support this proposal, he said, his voice firm. I would be honored to marry Sigrid and to help forge the alliance our fathers seek. And I believe my brother's marriage to Elthrith would strengthen Bjornheim in ways that a traditional political match could not. The discussion that followed was heated and prolonged, with arguments flying back and forth as the assembled leaders and warriors debated the merits and risks of the proposed arrangement. Ragnvald was initially adamant in his opposition, viewing Eiríkur's desire to marry a thrall as an insult to his daughter and a sign of poor judgment. But Sigrid proved to be a formidable advocate, using her considerable intelligence and rhetorical skill to address each objection systematically. She pointed out that her marriage to Bjorn would still achieve the desired alliance, would still unite the two families through blood. She argued that Eiríkur's willingness to elevate Elthrith demonstrated exactly the kind of independent thinking and courage that a future Jarl needed. She even suggested that having 2 marriages linking the families would create a stronger bond than one alone, providing redundancy in case one union failed to produce heirs. Thorstein, for his part, seemed less opposed to the idea than Eiríkur had feared. After listening to all the arguments, The Jarl called for a private conference with Ragnvald, and the two men withdrew to discuss the matter away from the crowd. The wait was agonizing, and Eiríkur found himself pacing the hall, unable to sit still while his future hung in the balance. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably less than one, the two Jarls emerged. Thorstein's expression was neutral, but Eiríkur thought he detected a slight upturn at the corner of his father's mouth. Ragnvald still looked displeased, but his rage had cooled to mere irritation. "We have reached a decision," Thorstein announced. "After careful consideration of all arguments presented, we have agreed to accept the proposed arrangement with certain conditions." Eiríkur's heart leaped, but he forced himself to remain calm and listen to the terms. "First," Thorstein continued, "Bjorn will marry Sigrid, cementing the alliance between our settlements as originally intended. Second, Eiríkur will be permitted to free Elthrith and marry her, but only after she has proven her value to the community by successfully treating at least 10 people of various ailments over the next 6 months. This will demonstrate that her healing knowledge is genuine and broadly applicable, not just a fortunate accident in Eirikir's specific case. Third," Ragnvald added, his voice gruff, "if Elthrith fails to meet this condition, or if Eirikir's health declines again, the marriage will be dissolved and Eiríkur will be required to make a political match approved by both Jarls. These terms are non-negotiable." The conditions were harsh but not unreasonable, Eiríkur realized. His fathers were protecting their settlement's interests while still allowing room for personal choice. It was a compromise, and like all compromises, it satisfied no one completely, but offered everyone something they wanted. "I accept these terms," Eiríkur said without hesitation. "As do I," Bjorn added. Sigrid nodded her agreement as well, and just like that, the matter was settled. The remainder of Ragnvald's visit was devoted to negotiating the specific terms of Bjorn and Sigrid's marriage, determining dowries and gifts, and planning the wedding that would take place in the spring. Eiríkur participated in these discussions as required, but his thoughts were constantly drawn to his longhouse and the woman waiting there. When he finally managed to extract himself from the endless rounds of negotiation and celebration, he practically ran through the snow-covered paths to his home. He burst through the door to find Elthrith sitting by the fire, and she looked up in alarm at his dramatic entrance. "Eiríkur, what has happened? Is something wrong?" "Nothing is wrong," he said, moving to kneel before her and taking her hands in his. "Everything is right, perhaps for the first time in my life. Elthrith, I have secured permission from my father to free you and to marry you, if you will have me." Her eyes widened in shock. "Marry you? But how? I thought you were to wed Sigrid." "Sigrid will marry my brother instead," Eiríkur explained quickly, the words tumbling over each other in his excitement. "And I will marry you, but there are conditions. You must prove your healing abilities by successfully treating 10 people over the next 6 months. Can you do that? Will you do that?" Elthrith's face went through a series of expressions: shock, disbelief, hope, and finally joy. Tears began streaming down her cheeks, and she laughed even as she cried. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "Yes, I can do that. I will do that. Oh, Eiríkur, I thought I had lost everything. Thought my life was over. And now you offer me not just freedom, but a future, a purpose, a chance at happiness I never dared to dream of." Eiríkur pulled her into his arms, holding her close and feeling as if a great weight had been lifted from his shoulders. For weeks they had circled around their feelings, both aware of the impossibility of their situation. Now, suddenly, impossibly, a path forward had opened before them. "I love you," he whispered into her hair. "I think I have loved you since that first day when you looked at me with those defiant green eyes and offered to help even though you had every reason to let me suffer." "And I love you," Elthrith replied, pulling back to look into his face. "You saw me as a person when I was just a slave, treated me with dignity when you had no obligation to do so. You gave me back myself when I thought that woman was lost forever." They kissed then, a kiss that carried all the pent-up longing and suppressed desire of the past weeks. It was tender and passionate, desperate and joyful, a perfect expression of everything they felt for one another. When they finally broke apart, both were breathless and smiling. The following months passed in a blur of activity and purpose. Elthrith threw herself into establishing her reputation as a healer, and word of her skills spread quickly through Bjornheim and beyond. She successfully treated a child's persistent cough that had resisted all other remedies. She helped an elderly woman whose joints had become so painful that she could barely walk. She correctly diagnosed and treated a young warrior whose symptoms had baffled the settlement's traditional healers. Each success built her credibility and demonstrated the value of her knowledge. By the time spring arrived, bringing with it the thaw and the wedding of Bjorn and Sigrid, Elthryth had successfully treated 14 people, exceeding the required number and silencing even the most skeptical voices. The wedding celebration was magnificent, with guests arriving from settlements throughout the region to witness the union of two prominent families. Bjorn and Sigrid stood before the assembled crowd and exchanged vows, and Eiríkur was pleased to see that they seemed genuinely content with the arrangement. Sigrid had confessed to him privately that she had convinced her father to bring Ragnar into their household guard, ensuring that she would at least be near the man she loved, even if she could not marry him. It was not a perfect solution, but it was better than nothing. As summer approached and the long days of the northern season brought warmth and light to Bjornheim, preparations began for another wedding. Eiríkur and Elthryth were to be married at midsummer, in a ceremony that would officially recognize her as a free woman and the future wife of the Jarl's heir. On the evening before the wedding, as the sun hung low in the sky but showed no sign of setting, Eiríkur and Elthryth walked together along the shore. The sea was calm, lapping gently at the rocks, and seabirds wheeled overhead, their cries carried on the gentle breeze. "Are you nervous about tomorrow?" Eiríkur asked, reaching out to take her hand. "A little," Elthryth admitted. "It still feels almost like a dream, like I might wake up and find myself back in that first day of captivity, with all of this nothing more than a beautiful fantasy." "It is real," Eiríkur assured her, bringing her hand to his lips. "You are real. This is real. And tomorrow we will stand before my people and pledge ourselves to one another for the rest of our lives." Elthryth stopped walking and turned to face him, her green eyes reflecting the golden light of the midnight sun. "I never thought I could be happy again after losing my family and my home," she said softly. "I thought that part of my life was over, that I would spend the rest of my days merely surviving rather than truly living. But you have given me a new life, Eiríkur, a new family, a new home. You have shown me that endings can also be beginnings, that from loss can come unexpected joy. We have given each other a new beginning," Eiríkur corrected gently. "You saved my life, Elthryth, in more ways than you know. You restored my health, yes, but you also showed me what it means to truly connect with another person, to see beyond the surface of status and position to the essential humanity beneath. You have made me a better man, and you will help me become a better leader when the time comes for me to assume my father's responsibilities." They kissed as the sun touched the horizon without dipping below it, as the world around them glowed with the magical light that characterized the far northern summers. And in that moment, with the sea at their backs and the settlement they both now called home spread out before them, they knew that they had found something rare and precious, a love forged in adversity, tempered by honesty, and strong enough to overcome any obstacle. The next day, Eiríkur and Elthryth were married in a ceremony that blended Norse traditions with acknowledgments of Elthryth's English heritage. She wore a dress of deep blue decorated with intricate embroidery that the women of Bjornheim had worked on for weeks, a wedding crown of flowers woven by the settlement's children, and around her neck, a gift from Thorstein himself, a silver pendant in the shape of intertwined serpents, symbolizing the binding of two lives into one. Eiríkur stood beside her, tall and strong and radiating the health and vitality that had returned to him through her knowledge and care. As they exchanged vows and rings, as they drank from the ceremonial cup and received the blessings of the community, he knew that he had made the right choice. Political considerations were important, alliances were valuable, but this marriage was built on something far stronger: genuine love, mutual respect, and a shared vision of the future. Years later, when Eiríkur became Jarl of Bjornheim and Elthryth stood beside him as his wife and the settlement's most respected healer, people would tell the story of the Viking who was always sick until the captured Englishwoman discovered the whole truth. They would speak of how an illness had brought two people together across the divide of language and culture, how suffering had led to healing, and how love had conquered the rigid boundaries of status and tradition. And Eiríkur and Elthryth, surrounded by the children they had raised and the community they had served together, would smile and remember those early days when everything had seemed impossible. They would remember the fear and the doubt, the obstacles and the opposition, and they would marvel at how far they had come. For they had learned the most important truth of all, that sometimes the answers we seek are found not in the familiar, but in the unexpected, not in power, but in compassion, not in what divides us, but in what brings us together. Their story became legend in Bjornheim, a testament to the power of knowledge, the importance of looking beyond surface differences, and the enduring strength of love that refuses to be constrained by the limitations others try to impose. And though their journey had begun in darkness and suffering, it had led them to a light that would illuminate the rest of their days, a happiness earned through courage, perseverance, and an unwavering commitment to following their hearts, even when the entire world seemed to stand in their way.